Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. They offer free checking with industry-leading mobile banking. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more.
We're just over a week away from Virginia Tech football season opener against Old Dominion on Saturday, September 2nd. And with that comes some news. Grant Wells is the Hokies' starting quarterback. We'll get into that and more on episode 306 of the Tech Sideline Podcast, which starts right now. We're recording this on Thursday, August 24th from Tech Sideline's high-tech studios in the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center. If you are watching on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and please share the podcast with a friend. As always, Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Bank with First Bank and Trust Company. I'm going to briefly toss this over to Will Stewart, who I was going to introduce in a second. He has more on that specific ad read.
Oh, that camera? Okay, good. So First Bank and Trust Company has launched a new checking account product, which is geared towards students. So if you're a student listening to this, or if you're a parent who has a student, check this out. They've got a checking account. It's called Checking with Perks, and it comes with roadside assistance, cell phone protection, so if you damage or lose your phone, fuel savings, and discounts on food, making it a great fit for college students. Normally, that checking account is $5 a month for all those perks and privileges, but now through November 1st, they're waiving the $5 monthly service charge, so you can try it out for free. Visit firstbank.com and look for Checking with Perks.
Sounds good. This episode is also brought to you by The Hokie Way.
Hokie Way.
The Hokie Way's Countdown to Kickoff Matching Donations campaign is currently underway. This fund drive is critically important to Virginia Tech NIL. The first $250,000 in donations will be matched. Visit thehokieway.org to learn more and to donate. I'm David Cunningham, Tech Sideline's managing editor, and your host for today's episode. Will Stewart, Tech Sideline's founder and general manager. He's in Chris Coleman's redshirt chair today. Chris is currently in Ireland and will be at the Notre Dame Navy game on Saturday, which is exciting for him. That's in Dublin. Across the way is Andy Bitter, Tech Sideline's senior staff writer, and Jack Brisendine, our fantastic sports media analytics student, is behind the scenes producing the show. So Tech gave us the news on Wednesday, and Brent Price said the news was going to come. Grant Wells is the program's starting quarterback. The redshirt senior from Charleston, West Virginia, won the job over Baylor transfer Kyron Drones. He started all 11 games for Hokies last season, throwing for 2,100 yards and 9 touchdowns, along with 9 interceptions. Andy, it seemed like it might have been trending that way for the majority of camp. We saw Wells and Drones go at each other in the spring. What was your reaction to the news?
Yeah, I think we all kind of anticipated this was the direction it was going to go when they announced. You too could hear the announcement for $10, I think, is what you had to pay to get the announcement of the starting quarterback for this team. This is something that we all kind of seen coming for a while, I think. You know, when we talked to Pry afterwards, he made it sound like it was closer than a lot of us thought in terms of Wells sort of had the lead early in camp. There was a surge there by Kyron for a couple days where it seemed like he might be the guy, and then it goes back to Wells, and he kind of ran away with it here, I guess, in the last week or so. So not a surprise. They said, or this was Pry's words after spring balls, that right now Grant's our top guy, but Kyron will play. And it's the same situation now. This is what they basically said yesterday. Wells is the starter. Kyron Drones will play in some capacity. We'll play every week, was what Pry said. Those were his words. So it's an interesting situation. Not a lot of coaches have pulled off this 2 quarterback thing. I know they're not calling that 2 quarterback system, but they are trying to play 2 quarterbacks at the same time. And, the history of college football is littered with very bad situations where that has gone awry. And I feel like it's maybe this offensive staff trying to do something a little too complicated when they need to walk before they can run with this new setup they have.
Speaking of that, Will, I want to ask you about times Virginia Tech has tried to use two quarterbacks before in the past, whether it be Marcus Vick and Brian Randall or Sean Glennon and Tyrod Taylor. I think everyone would argue that the Hendon Hooker-Braxton Burmeister experiment was not handled very, very well, which resulted in Hendon Hooker walking.
Well, throw COVID into the mix with that too.
Yes.
It's just a complete
bad
mess
situation
from start to finish.
What do you remember about those specific instances with Vic and Randall and Tyrod and Glennon, and in your perspective, looking at this one, what do you maybe expect?
So let's take them in order. Let's start with Vic and Randall. Sorry, Frank, but I think that was handled horribly. Andy might remember the details better than I do, but you weren't covering Tech back then, right?
Partially. I covered games here and there. I covered that, what was that, Hurricane game, Texas A&M.
Yeah.
So I was in and out of games around that time. I covered that Miami game where they ended Miami's streak,
Right.
which I also believe was 2003. So yeah.
So when you talk about Vic and Randall in 2003, the one that comes to mind is when they played Boston College, and I don't remember the details, but Tech came out and they were smoking on offense with Brian Randall starting the game, and they just did what they wanted to for a quarter, and then they brought in Vic, and the air went out of the offense. And Boston College was able to come back and eventually win the game. Now, Tech had some defensive problems. There's more to it than just the quarterback rotation. But I remember that as being an example of, it was almost like, and again, I don't remember the details, but it was almost like Frank thought to himself, well, Randall's going to do the first two series and then Vic, and then Randall for two and then Vic, without any, kind of feel for how the game was going. That's what I remember about that.
Like it was scripted.
Yes. And I remember I remember in general, I think the Tyrod Taylor, Sean Glennon stuff was handled well. I don't think that hurt the offense. And I'm painting with a very broad brush over the course of two seasons. So what's the next one? Burmeister and Hooker?
Yeah.
Well, people get mad when we say this is a whole separate podcast in and of itself. And they're like, well, then talk about it. And you just can't argue that one just didn't go well. In retrospect, I don't have any insider knowledge or anything, but in retrospect, it was just kind of obvious that Hooker should have been the guy, and Burmeister wound up becoming a wide receiver at San Diego State. And, once you see how those two things played out, it should have been Hooker. There shouldn't have been a competition.
There's a whole other layer to that whole thing with COVID, and Hendon had his health scare earlier in the year. He and Fuente had a rift about, players opting out and who was on what side of that whole thing. And I don't think they ever recovered from that. And that was obvious by the end of the season, where Hendon had his cold spell against Clemson, however we want to describe that. And I think it was just over at that point. I mean, those two were at the breaking point, and that was just it between trust.
It was time to
between
break up.
Trust between coach and quarterback, and that was a two-way street. So, there were complicating elements besides just playing time in that 2021 or 2020 season.
It is kind of unfair to look at how things ended up and draw judgments. And let me draw a parallel. There's a theory out there that Virginia Tech had a chance at SEC membership long about 2011 or so, when the SEC wound it up adding Missouri, Texas A&M and Missouri. There's the old thing, well, it should have been Texas A&M and Virginia Tech. And in retrospect, it seems patently obvious, opinions differ on whether or not that was actually a thing going on behind the scenes. Let's say it was. Let's say the SEC called Virginia Tech up and said, hey, what do you think? And Virginia Tech said no. Well, it's 2023, and it's pretty obvious that the money's become this huge difference. But I said something about this on the message boards or at some point, and Bill Roth texted me, and he called me, and he said, you got to put things in historical perspective. Long about 2010 or 2011, the ACC's payout was either comparable or ahead of all other conferences. Now, you could kind of see that train at the end of the tunnel with the SEC launching a network, but the Tech officials had always wanted to be in the ACC. They were, and the money at that point in time is good. Yep. So don't be unfair passing judgment, 12 years later on what might have been a thing at that point in time. So I get your point there. What I personally don't want the Drones thing to be is what it wound up being with Quincy Patterson. Every time Quincy came in, you knew what they were going to run. It looked the same every time. And sure, there were exceptions like the long run against UNC and the
pass to Hazleton.
Yes. So
send it to another overtime.
There were bright, shining moments where Quincy did things other than run straight into the line. But for the most part, he ran straight into the line for a 2 to 4 yard gain. Yeah. And if he's truly going to play, so I did listen to the live stream and I went and looked at my quotes later and I'm like, did Pryor really say Drones is going to play each and every game? And he did. He said that. I don't want it to be, hey, let's snap it to him and have him pause and run straight up the middle. So it'll be interesting to see how this coaching staff handles it.
I think in their defense, they've said that he's going to have the whole playbook, or they intend for him to have the whole playbook. Now we'll see. And, Price said it the other day, there is a running ability that a 6'3", 235-pound quarterback has. That's a real attribute that he has not really been able to show. They've not been live. They weren't live in the spring. They haven't been live in August. And, he has that part of his game that maybe doesn't show up until you put him in the game. Yeah. Now, that's not to say they're going to run him on every play. I think he's capable of throwing it. I've seen him in the RPO. He seems to run that pretty well in the limited portions of practice that we've seen. So I think this is more than you have a 250-pound quarterback or however much Quincy Patterson weighed and just run straight into the line. That was your power rushing game. Because, I think at the time, McLeese was the running back, not a very big running back. It's not like
that was the same time when they used Dalton Keene to run the ball. Right, exactly.
They were searching for somebody to be that power running back guy. I don't think that's the same situation now. I just think it's such an incredibly tough thing. I mean, you talk about Bryant Randall, Marcus Vick. That situation resolved itself with Vic's antics where he was suspended for the year, and then Brian Randall is the ACC Player of the Year. Yeah. So it shows you how difficult that is. I mean, you had a future ACC Player of the Year that's sort of hamstrung because you're going back and forth. Of course, he developed in his career and he got better by the end, but it is such a tough thing to pull off, the two quarterback thing. I mean, Clemson did it a little bit last year, swapping back and forth between those guys, and I think that really hindered their team and what they were able to accomplish. So again, there's so many things that they need to do offensively first that I just don't know if you need to heap on trying to juggle this two quarterback thing at the same time.
Yeah, the only thing I can add to that is I'm watching a World War II documentary on Netflix, and there's the old war quote about no plan survives contact with the enemy. So they have ideas of what they want to do, but when that game is actually in progress, the defense is doing things you didn't expect. The sphincter tightens up a little bit, and you're like, should we really have Kyron throw it? Let's just run him into the line, that kind of thing.
I think there's a more modern version of that quote from Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched.
Yes. We've heard this kind of thing a lot. Yeah.
So Price says both quarterbacks are going to play. He was very adamant about that yesterday. He said, quote, Grant's the starter. Grant gets the majority of the work, but people are going to have to prepare for Kyron. Andy, you asked Pry and offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach Tyler Bowen yesterday about it. How do they handle the delicate dance of trying to use two quarterbacks? What do you expect we will see?
I don't know. I don't know if this is just lip service because this is what you have to do in this day and age to keep everybody happy. I mean, if Drones is not the starter, he could up and transfer. He could. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation right now. So I don't know if this is a sort of a juggling act that they have to do to try to keep everybody in the fold, keep them satisfied with their role, and kind of keep that carrot out in front of them so that they can continue to practice and feel like they're part of this thing so they don't have to go elsewhere to find playing time. That's really what you see a lot at the quarterback position. Or if it's like, we really do think these two guys are that close and that they can both come in and run this offense and be effective. I think Drones is slightly different from Wells from a skill set perspective. So that would be something else that an opposing defense has to prepare for. I don't know you have to show it for them to have to prepare for it every week. If you don't show it, they're not going to take it seriously. So, I guess we'll see. I mean, I guess this is a card that the Hokies have to play still, how they're going to handle this whole thing. But the history of trying to get two quarterbacks in the game is just messy. And I'm curious how they're going to do it.
If you're Old Dominion, which quarterback do you feel like is more difficult to prepare for?
Old Dominion's prepared for Grant Wells like 5 times in his career, right? I mean, he has played Old Dominion or been on a team that played Old Dominion a bunch. So it's not like he's some mystery to that defense. So I guess you'd have to say Drones, just in terms of newness, because there's no film on him. You haven't played him before, but I guess we'd probably have to ask some defensive coordinators about that, who's more difficult to prepare for.
Before we move on, I just want to touch on a few injury notes that we got from yesterday's practice. Price said tight end Nick Gallo suffered an injury. The Hokies are still trying to determine its severity. We'll talk more about the tight ends in a little bit. Defensive tackle Gunnar Givens and running back Jeremiah Coney had minor surgeries that will keep him out the first couple of weeks, according to Pry. Just wanted to touch on that. You look puzzled. What do you...
I'm just wondering what minor surgery heals itself in a few weeks. I'm just curious, whether it's soft tissue or bone or something like that.
I don't know.
Yeah.
They didn't specify.
I feel like Dorian had a minor surgery, like the way they phrased that last year, that ended up keeping him out the entire season. So
yeah.
I don't know. It's not the news you want to get on the eve of the season that these guys are going to be out for sure for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
The Gallo thing, maybe a little bit more distressing, kind of based on what we've heard in terms of severity of that and the fact that it's still open-ended. They don't know how severe it is. It's like, well, it's definitely not playing at Old Dominion if it's still up in the air how severe it is right now. So that's a veteran guy there, and then gets really young behind them. But you just don't want to see injuries this time of year. You're so close to getting through the offseason and get into the part that actually counts the season that you don't want to get guys banged up going into that portion.
Well, while we're on tight ends, let's talk about tight ends. The young tight ends in the room might have to step up now with Gallo out, being injured. Tyler Bowen says he feels really good about the trio of Daquan Wright, Benji Gosnell, and Harrison St. Germain. But that's a lot of youth. Andy, how do you feel just about that experience? We saw Daquan Wright a lot last year, but Harrison St. Germain didn't really play a whole lot, and Benji Gosnell is coming off 2 injuries.
Yeah, not exactly a picture of health, that group. I mean, Daquan's had his issues here, had a strain this camp that's kept him out. Benji Gosnell coming off an ACL last year and one in high school. We're talking about 3 second-year players, only one of which got any playing time last year, plus a freshman that just arrived in Zeke Wimbush. That is a young group. I think, I see Gosnell out there, and I see him moving around. I think if he can stay healthy, he could be a real player. I think he's got some really good ability. I think he slipped through the cracks recruiting-wise because of the injury. Tech obviously had his brother coming here around the same time, so I think that was beneficial in his recruitment. I think they can be good. It's such an unproven group. I don't really know what they're like as blockers. We haven't seen them in a lot of action. I don't know if Gallo was an exceptional blocker, but he was a veteran. He's been around in a lot of this stuff, and I think he's proved he can play in that spot. So you go from having a veteran guy who's been through a lot of battles to all of a sudden a lot of youth, a lot of inexperience. Daquan was basically a slot receiver last year. Didn't play a whole lot. Up on the line in terms of a sort of a traditional tight end role. So it just opens up a lot more question marks in a spot that, they didn't think they were going to have those question marks coming in.
Yeah, that becomes my question is what do you lose with Gallo not being able to play? And it sounds like you might lose at the very least some experience blocking on the line. You're right. According to what you say, Wright was really more of a receiver last year as opposed to a blocking tight end. So how does that change, what's available in the playbook? And it's not really what's available in the playbook, but what do they feel comfortable calling when they need to pick up, certain number of yards? Maybe that takes some plays out of the playbook that they would run if Gallo were playing.
Yeah, I think the good news is we saw Wright being used as a pass catcher last year. I mean, he's very big, and I think in some ways he's a big matchup problem. I think he's, and I'm sure if Chris was here, Chris would probably say it. He can be a very big receiving option. But I think it all comes down to the blocking and the schematics there. Like Andy said, Gallo was a veteran.
I think part of it, there's less of a need for him to step into that slot receiver role because they added so many receivers.
Well,
I think they're deeper at those receiver spots that maybe you don't have to put your 6'4" guy out there in the slot as a match. I mean, it's nice to have that matchup problem, but at times you would just like a slot receiver out there instead.
Well, we're going to talk about that right now. Pry said yesterday that the top 4 wideouts in the program are Ollie Jennings, Daquan Felton, Jalen Lane, and Steven Gosnell. Considering where the Hokies were a year ago, that's a pretty good top 4.
Yeah, well, it's telling me, we haven't gotten to the second team yet, but he listed another 4 guys, and Dawan Lofton was not among that group. Dawan Lofton was their second leading wide receiver last year. It was Caleb Smith, a large gap, and then Gallo and Dawan Lofton were the next 2. Now it sounds like they won't have Gallo, at least for the ODU opener, and Dawan Lofton is pretty far down the depth chart. Didn't have a chance to ask him, Pry, about that yesterday, but it really tells you how they've reshaped that wide receiver room, just how many more options they've brought in. Now, you get to that second group of guys, they listed the next 4. Takai Heath's in there.
Xavion Turner Bradshaw, a redshirt freshman. Sophomore Tucker Holloway. True freshman Takai Heath and Aiden Green.
Yeah, it's pretty inexperienced. And Holloway played what, like 4 games? Very limited snaps.
The only one that had any snaps last year was Holloway.
Yeah, and that was mostly as a punt returner, and he got most of his action at the end of the year. I think at the Liberty game was probably his biggest work as a wide receiver. So a lot of youth there, but I think there is some promise. I've been pretty high on Aiden Green and how he's performed at practice. Every time we're out of practice,
he had a really good catch yesterday.
Yeah, he seems to do something every time we're out there in practice. We're not out there very long. It's not like he's got 90 minutes to show us something. It's usually in like a 15-minute span. We're like, oh, Aiden Green made another play. So I think he's going to be one that's going to be tough to keep off the field as a true freshman.
So one of the things Chris has talked about, and I think this is worth paying attention to, is certainly as a group, the wide receivers are more talented. But they, Chris wrote when he did his wide receiver preview for us probably a couple of weeks back. One of the things he talked about, and I think he's talked about on the podcast, was drop rate, that the drop rate is kind of high career-wise with Jennings. Unfortunately, he didn't drop that one against Virginia Tech last year when he was playing for Old Dominion. Tech could have used him dropping one there. And you guys just talked about Lofton. Lofton's had a pretty high drop rate as well. So there is no question that there's more talent there, I think. But can they cut down on the drops and be more reliable?
Andy, out of that top 4, Jennings, Felton, Lane, Gosnell, that seems like a pretty big variety, especially when you throw Felton in there. Which of those players do you think might make the biggest difference? Because I know Jennings is obviously proven at Old Dominion. Lane's proven as a kind of a slot guy at Middle Tennessee. And then you've got Felton. And then it seems like Gosnell's kind of the most consistent guy out of the 4.
Yeah, it's a nice mix of guys. I mean, we've seen Felton out there at practice. We talked to Derek Jones last week. He's just a matchup problem. And it's like the play might not be open, but he can still make a play because his size. Had a little one-on-one with Dante Lovett where Lovett didn't get the jam at the line the other day and Felton got free for an easy touchdown in a goal line situation. So I think he's going to be a real big red zone threat. I think that's where he can help the most. I'm curious to see Lane. Ollie Jennings has put up a lot of numbers. I think Lane in the slot can be something really interesting because he was very productive last year, Middle Tennessee. I think they like him operating in the slot in space like that. That was a position last year that Tech never really had. They didn't really have that receiver that just got open all the time and got those easy receptions. It seemed like everything was difficult last year in the passing game and trying to find guys open. I think it would help Grant Wells a lot, or whoever's playing quarterback, if that slot receiver gets open, makes for a lot of easy throws that the quarterback doesn't have to really get it in a tight window on the sideline or something like that to push the ball down the field.
There's one other guy I want to talk about is Xavion Turner Bradshaw. We've seen a lot more out of him now recently. He's a redshirt freshman. It was it Malachi Thomas? There was a player who called him Mansour Delane, who called him a jackrabbit.
Jackrabbit.
This is about Xavion Turner Bradshaw last week. We saw him repping with the ones when Tech was doing its like 2-point conversion, some of its red zone stuff the other day. Seems like he's a guy that's come a long way and could potentially factor in. Yeah,
he's another one. I thought Pry, maybe his statements were a little more cautious about him when we brought it up and saying that it's inconsistent from practice to practice. And I think you're going to get that from a redshirt freshman, but he is a jitterbug, as we like to say. Going back to our Khalil Pimpleton days, we always like to call him a jitterbug. But he's a shifty guy. He's tough to get a hand on out there, and I think those guys can succeed when you get them out in space and create opportunities for them. Get the ball in their hands, see what they can do, and go make a play.
Yeah, we've all seen the play that Jalen Lane had against Miami. Am I remembering the right play where he caught it short and took it the length of the field? I think you can look at slot guys in two ways: guys who can run those short curls and get the catch, which is helpful if you have a young offensive line that can't hold their blocks very long. But a guy who can also turn the short stuff into an explosive play is, I think, something Tech's been missing. So it'll. Tavion Robinson, I think, had some of that ability, but he didn't have elite speed. He could get behind a defense, but in my opinion, he would get caught. It'd be nice to have a guy that can take that short one and add another 40 or 50 yards to it. And from the way you guys talk, it sounds like Lane is a possibility for that. And Bradshaw, if he continues to develop. I agree with what you said about the inconsistency in him being young. I think he's made a lot of progress in a year, but he needs to continue making progress in the discipline in his game. Because if it is a thing where Lane is the number one slot receiver and maybe Bradshaw's number two, Bradshaw really needs to be ready to step up in a year or two when Lane's gone.
One of the last things before we get to a little fun game I have for you, Will, I want to go over the number one offensive line. It's kind of what we've seen all fall camp. Xavier Chaplin at left tackle, Braylon Moore at left guard, Caden Moore at center, Bob Schick at right guard, Parker Clements at right tackle. Brent Pry announced that that's going to be the number one offensive line for Old Dominion next week. Andy, Xavier Chaplin, we're actually going to speak with him later this afternoon. We're scheduled to speak with him. He's a guy that we asked Pry about yesterday, and Pry's just excited about him. He seems like he's very raw, didn't play a whole lot last year, but he seems like a guy with a lot of potential, and he's going to be relied on right away as a redshirt freshman.
He's huge. We saw him walking through the hallway the other day. I'm like, that's got to be Chaplin. There's nobody else that's that big in this program. You're right. I've never spoken to him. True freshman last year. We can't speak to them, and I don't think we've had him in the spring, and I didn't get him at media day. So this will be our first opportunity to talk to him. They are putting a lot on his plate as a redshirt freshman coming in. I think he's played 27 snaps, all against Liberty at the end of the year. They had the safety on Wells where they got to him and came off that side. I don't know if that was necessarily Chaplin's responsibility on that play or if there was somebody else beside him, but I think he had a hand in that whole thing. So I think there's going to be some rawness there. I think he's got plenty to learn at the position, but they don't have a ton of options at tackle. I mean, it's a pretty slight crew there right now, and they got to roll with the guys they have. And I think they like Chaplin. I think they like Braylon Moore on that left side. They're both redshirt freshmen who are starting, and that's got to be concerning just from an experience standpoint. And I don't know about strength. I think they'll be a more powerful group, and Pry likes the aggression that they have this year, maybe a little bit compared to last year. But I think that still gives you a little bit reason for pause, just the entire left side being redshirt freshmen.
Who was the one guy you talked to at media day, David, where you said that was the one guy where you found yourself looking up?
Oh, it was Daquan. It was Daquan Felton.
Daquan Felton,
yeah, because he's tall.
so Chaplin's what, 19 years old, going to be talking to the media? Hopefully that'll go well for him.
Yeah, I'm sure. One of the other guys said they talked to him and he was good. Virginia Tech returns one guy who is actually going to be playing at his position this year. Obviously, Caden Moore started last year for the Hokies and has been a starter for a couple years, but he's moving over to center. Parker Clements is back, and I know Chris found it really interesting that heading into the last season, he was a little bit banged up, a little bit injured. He really kind of started to take off and hit his form at the end of the year. Seems like this could be a pretty, if Clements can get back to his old form, and he's the most experienced guy on that offensive line. He's been a starter for a couple years. Seems like he could kind of lead that offensive line forward.
Yeah, I think so. I think that injury last year, I think he said it himself. He couldn't lift for like 16 or 20 weeks or something like that. It's like he just didn't have the same kind of strength going into the season. I think that helped explain why later in the year he started to look a bit more like himself. Clements, the Moore brothers, Chaplin, Pry, praised all of them yesterday. And then the fifth guy, you asked about Bob Schick after that. He was a little bit more hesitant about that. He said good thing. He's made a lot of progress, but I think that right guard spot is still just not where they want it. And, Schick is going to get the first opportunity there. I think Brody Meadows, I think Clayton Frady could still be possibilities there. I think they have 4 guys they feel pretty solid about, but they're still searching for that fifth spot to see if Schick can be that guy or somebody else. And if you're searching for 5, that means you probably don't feel comfortable about 6, 7, 8 at this point either. So it's a really thin group. It doesn't have a ton of experience. And, last year they didn't really have any injuries on the offensive line. I don't know how many seasons you're going to get where that happens. I mean, it's just you get knocked around, somebody falls on your leg from the wrong side. It's just inevitable that you're going to have an injury there, and you got to have more guys ready to step up. And I think that's really going to be where this offensive line is one spot where it'll be challenged this fall.
Yeah, I want to mention Parker Clements real quick. His PFF grade in 2021 his offensive PFF grade was a 76.8. That's pretty good.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
His PFF grade last year was 50.1. And he didn't grade above a 60 until the Georgia Tech game, which was the third to last game of the year. And then it wasn't until the Liberty game where he graded above a 70, the very last game of the year. So he clearly got better as the season went on. I'm excited to see what he can do and if he can get back to that old form. What were you going to say?
Oh, I hearken back to an earlier podcast where we found out that he'd missed that much time in the weight room. And I remember saying the struggle is real. I missed three months in the weight room and lost all of the strength I'd built up over the course of like a year and a half. So just again, pointing out to fans that is a big deal. Question I wanted to ask you guys, I've heard y'all talk about Brody Meadows being that guy that they can try some at tackle and try some at guard. What are you hearing about Frady? What's the story on him?
Somebody asked probably about Frady
Damien
yesterday. Yeah, Damien.
He got here this summer. He had to finish up his degree at Gardner-Webb, and sometimes you get those transfers. They get here right away after the spring. I think he wasn't here till later in the summer. So there's getting used to the offense, conditioning type thing. I'm actually a little surprised he hasn't been more in this competition, and maybe that's something we can ask Crook about later today. But he was a veteran guy. He was brought in, I thought, for the express purpose of competing for a starting job. So it's kind of interesting to me that Schick has risen up to take that spot. They moved Meadows over to the right guard, and Frady's been playing some left guard along with Johnny Dixon behind Braylon Moore. So I mean, they're mixing guys around, trying to find the right match. But I still think you got to go into the season with like 7 or 8 that you can trust, or at least rotate in that you can find the right combination. Because I don't know if they're going to put out a starting 5 and that's going to be the 5 all season. I think that'll change at some point.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things is in that 2 deep, there's a lot of youth back there. I mean, we're looking at Laith Gannon potentially as the left tackle if something were to happen to Xavier Chapwood. He's a true freshman.
Wow.
So there's a whole bunch of youth there. All right, game time for you, Will. We're gonna play. Can Will name Virginia Tech's starting defense this year?
Y'all are about to find out why I'm no longer on the podcast.
We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the defense because we kind of know the depth chart is pretty much set. There's a good core, I think, a good 11 starters, I think, that we have a grasp of defensively. So I want to go down the line defensively. We will start at defensive end. Who do you feel like Virginia Tech's 2 defensive ends are going to be this season?
Not who do I feel, but what do I recall? Well, APR is going to be one of them. Is the other starter going to be Burgos?
Antoine Powell-Round. I would lean Cole Nelson.
I think it'd be Cole Nelson.
Okay.
Just based on experience. The comments yesterday probably had about it where I think Burgos, where it's like, again, it's youth, it's inconsistency. Yeah. Sometimes it shows up and he makes these exceptional plays, but the play-to-play consistency isn't quite the same as somebody like Nelson, who maybe won't make as many eye-popping plays as Burgos does, but my experience with coaches is they trust the consistency more than the eye-popping, eye-popping, flash-in-the-pan type stuff.
I think C.J. McCray is kind of in that consistent boat, too. All right, defensive tackle.
So wait a minute. I do want to inject one thing. I was not aware Cole Nelson had played close to 400 snaps. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Quietly played. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a lot of snaps. Okay.
Oh
So
yeah, I told you that in the office the other day when I was
Yes.
writing my Antoine Powell Ryland story.
right. You were talking
Powell
about the
Ryland-
snaps everybody had, and I looked at you and said Nelson played like 397 snaps or something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, Powell Ryland, 500. He's automatically the most veteran guy in that room, and then McRae and Nelson are both between about 350 and 400.
All right. So defensive tackle.
You
Is,
know who those guys are going to
well,
be.
Narelle Pollard and Josh Fuga, right? Kendricks is backing up one of them. Panay would be the other backup.
I would presume, and then I think
Feldarius Payne.
I think
might
Feldarius
be in
Payne
that
will
mix,
factor in, yeah.
with Panay, possibly ahead of Panay there.
And-
It seems like Fuga has taken over one of those starting. And every time we've been out there, it seems like Kendricks has been with the twos.
Yeah,
Where the end of last year, Pry was saying Kendricks was kind of the guy, and he had been playing the best of anybody, and he was coming off an injury the previous season. They said by the end of the year, he was their best tackle. So kind of interesting the way that's shifted in that group. But I think you can look at those top three. They're kind of say they're all starters because I think they're all going to play that much.
Yeah, I think I kind of look at Pollard and Kendricks as the Maddie and Daddy of their era. So it's great to have a guy like Kendricks.
Florida boys coming up here.
Kind of picked up late in the recruiting process. All right, what's next?
linebacker.
The Mike is Jaden Keller. Is that right?
I presume that's who it's going to be. Yes, and he's been battling that out with a combination of Alan Tisdale, mostly Jaden McDonald.
Too many Jadens and Jalen's. All right. Speaking of Jalen's, what's next?
We can go Will.
The star.
The star.
Isn't the star the other one of the
That's Sam linebacker.
Sam line? And
So
the
that's-
Mike and the star are your middle linebackers, right?
No, your Will and your Mike.
So let's talk about the Will then.
Okay.
Now I don't know. is there a
he had
Jalen?
Here's
an
a hint. He's like 6'6".
He had an interception last year.
Oh man, I'm blanking, guys.
Was it against Syracuse or Georgia Tech? Where he had that one where he tipped it up and caught it and returned it for a touchdown?
See, isn't this funny? I'm blanking.
Kelly Lawson.
Kelly. Okay, right.
Your star, which is your Sam, I guess it would have been Bud's whip.
Kind of
probably.
like your whip.
Now
I'm
started there last year.
See, now I'm panicking because I couldn't remember Kelly Lawson.
He's got
Keontae
the long
Jenkins.
dreads. Okay.
Yes.
Keontae Jenkins.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll go to cornerback.
Mansour Delane, and is Canteen going to be the other starter?
Canteen will probably be the third guy.
Canteen's probably your starting nickel,
Okay.
which I think they consider a starting position because they play.
Dorian Strong.
Dorian Strong. Yeah. And then at safety,
That'll be Jalen Stroman.
and a guy who played just about every
the
snap
wide
last year.
receiver.
No, veteran.
Oh,
Also has dreads.
I'm Nasir Peoples.
There you go.
Bingo.
Not bad.
Yeah. Not
So
bad.
the only one we really forgot was Kelly Lawson.
Yeah, and Kelly, I don't know why Kelly Lawson lives in this blind spot in my brain. As much as he has played, I can't explain that. That was kind of odd.
And I think at those linebacker spots, I think Tisdale could be in the mix at either of those.
Yeah.
Mike, with the way Pry was talking about him the other day, I haven't heard him talk about Tisdale like that since he's
What did
been
he say?
here. Just he's playing better pad level, seeing things better. He's saying he's playing his best football since he's been here. When you hear that about a guy who's been here, I think
long
it's his
time.
5th year. Compared to the young guys that they have in Kelly Lawson and Keller, who are still learning the positions, I think you have to consider him an option in that mix. And I don't know if that's going to be a starting option, but I think he's going to play quite a bit.
Tisdale is a guy that
Oh yeah, let me read the Tisdale quote for you. So this is from Brent Pry last week. Specifically on Tisdale, he's had a good 4, 5, 6 practices. He's playing fast and confident, and he's slipping blocks instead of tying up. He's just showing a little wiggle and dropping his shoulder and getting by a guy. He's just flashing a lot more often right now. He was a guy that was generally in the right place, but I think he'd often be high and he would get ragdolled a little bit. He's playing lower. He's playing with better leverage. He's getting by people a little bit better.
I love when Pry gets into his play. He's playing a little high, gets ragdolled out there. It's like that's not like something Bud would say back in the day. It's like
and I could see him doing that thing with his hands.
Yeah, this-
Great
yeah.
explanation. I love it.
I was getting ready to say Tisdale is a guy that I want to sit down with and do an in-depth interview someday, because I think that I think there's a lot there below the surface that we don't know about. We know about was it a gambling related suspension last year for like 6 games? There's a story there, but I think
for NBA final. Let's make it clear, he was betting on the NBA finals.
Yeah.
It's not an Iowa State situation where they're betting on their own team and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That suspension the NCAA handed down was absurd for Alan Tisdale. Just put that on the record right there.
But I also think there's some personal responsibilities he's had throughout his life, and I think managing school and football has been a challenge for him. But he's a guy that's stuck with it, and he's still here. And I want to get into that with him. I want to talk to him sometimes, sit down with him for half an hour or an hour and just kind of go through it with him and get the inside story on that.
Well, he also has a kid who's like 2 years old.
That's what I'm saying.
That's another responsibility added into this whole thing. And I think when we talk to coaches, Justin Hamilton previously is like, we saw a different Allen when he had that responsibility as well. He became more mature in that sense, and in how he went about his football business, but also his personal life, because you have to, you're thrown into the fire. There's no off button with a kid. It is on at that point. So I think that changes your life radically.
Well, some guys do hit the off button. They don't take their responsibilities. And Chris Coleman and his grocery store stories, he's seen Tisdale at the grocery store probably buying diapers or something like that. So I think there's some stuff going on there, and I'd love to get into it with him.
Before we continue, it's a great time to remind you that this show is brought to you by the Hokie Way. The Hokie Way's Countdown to Kickoff Matching Donations campaign is underway. This fund drive is critically important to Virginia Tech NIL. The first $250,000 in donations will be matched. Visit thehokieway.org to learn more and to donate. Thank you so much for the Hokie Way and First Bank and Trust Company for their sponsorship of the Tech Sideline Podcast.
Now, the Hokie Way has, I think, 9 days left. It runs up until kickoff of the ODU game. So we're going to be, I know there's lots of asks right now. They just did Triumph Together the last couple of days. And so now we're going to be pushing the Hokie Way's Countdown to Kickoff campaign pretty hard for the next 9 days until the kickoff of that game.
So we've been going about 40-ish minutes. Let's spend the last few minutes of this episode discussing what some might consider to be the elephant in the room. On Friday, August 18th, so last Friday, ESPN's Andrea Adelson published a story titled Why Virginia Tech Unraveled After Frank Beamer's Tenure. Can the Hokies Recover? In the story, which Andrea said she spent 20 months on, dating back to January 2022, she interviewed a number of people involved with the program during the Justin Fuente era. Most of the interviews were off the record and anonymous, though Tech's athletic director, Whit Babcock, granted her an interview, and former players Houshun Gaines and Quincy Patterson made public comments in the piece. There's a lot to unpack, Will, but I want to start with you. What was and is now your overall takeaway from the piece, and how do you view it?
We were told at the 2022 ACC football kickoff that a story was coming from Andrea. And of course, it didn't appear till a year later. Reading the article, what went through my mind was, yep, knew that. Yep, knew about that. Heard about that. There really wasn't anything in there that surprised me. And so we caught a little guff from the Twitter crowd, just a little. And I'm not sure if anybody said this on our message board or not, but they basically said, if you guys knew all this, why weren't you writing about it? It's a lot easier for an outside person like Andrea Adelson to write an article like that. She works for ESPN. She's got a job, whether she throws Tech under the bus or not. It is a very touchy situation for people like us to write a hit piece. But these things had been talked about on our message boards for years. So this stuff was out there. And that's not to discredit her reporting. She did her homework. But you asked what my first takeaway was. That was it. And the other one was, wow, she kind of went after John Boleyn for a good 10, 12, 15 paragraphs. And that's the other thing I noticed.
Yeah. First of all, there's a lot of stuff we have reported on. The financial struggles, facility upgrades. I mean, I've written about this many times over the course of 7-8 years. So it's not like
that's
it's
the
not
Captain
like,
Obvious stuff. Yeah.
Well, there's you come outside, you put it all into one story, and you see it all in one spot like that. And I think it's a little more shocking than when it's reported over the course of time. I mean, there's the player discontent thing in 2018 that was covered quite a bit by everybody, the facility and other problems that they had in terms of funding. There's some great anecdotes in there that were brand new that I'd never heard. The weight room weights weigh the same, that quote, which I think is going to pop up on some t-shirts in the future here by smart aleck people, which, I wholeheartedly approve. I mean, that's made for t-shirts like that. I thought there was some interesting framing in it that I don't necessarily agree with. First of all, the headline, how Virginia Tech unraveled after Frank Beamer. The unraveling was already starting before Frank finished. I mean, those last 4 years that Frank was here, he was this revered person in the program. The issues were already starting to bubble up there in terms of funding, staffing, trying to get a recruiting staff up off the ground, starting from scratch. They were late with that. Staff salaries, I think, lagged behind. The facilities was another thing that doesn't just happen overnight. I mean, this is something that has been, they don't address for a long time. Then all of a sudden you're trying to play catch up. They mentioned the dorms. Oh, there's no air conditioning in the dorms for players on visits or something like that. Tech knew that. It just takes a while to build new dorms. And now they have the brand new, whatever they want to call it, the innovation campus or however they're phrasing it.
So let me jump in here. That
there.
dorm actually has something like 550 beds in it. And all of the freshman athletes live in that dorm. But that's only like 100 in any given year, like 150 to 180.
Well, I think by
athletes.
rule it has to be under half. I think there's the NCAA rule says you can't have an only athlete.
What bothered
dorm.
me is I saw it called a football dorm. No, it's not a football dorm. It is a campus dorm, and the athletes are like you said, a certain portion of it.
Make no mistake, the football players were high priority in trying to build that dorm.
That was the driver.
So I think it's not like Frank Beamer retired and then things just went off the rails. It was already starting to kind of go that way. I've written before. I think that there's this pendulum of blame that people have for where Virginia Tech got. And I think when Justin Fuente got fired or came to the settlement to no longer be the coach here, it kind of swung too far in one direction. Everybody's like, Fuente ruined this program. He crashed this Ferrari. I've used that analogy before. I don't think that was the case. And I think it swung a little too far that way. And I think with this story, it swung a little bit too far the other way because, I mentioned the framing. I think there was clearly some sources in this who had an axe to grind with Whit and John Boleyn. I think that was obvious from the very start where John Boleyn was made out to be this, the big bad in this situation. Like, you have that in like a season of Justified or something like that. It's like this is the guy that's taking down this program, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I know he and Fuente clashed on some stuff. I think there was a frosty relationship there. I don't think it was to the point where Boleyn was preventing Fuente from succeeding. I think there was a quote in there that said, Nick Saban couldn't have succeeded with the sandbags that they threw on Fuente. It's like that. First of all, I think I know who said that quote based on, on the phrasing. There's some, I'm not going to go there, but there's some hyperbole there that's just, that is overstating the situation.
But it's also true that Boleyn didn't go to bat for Fuente.
I think what was one of the biggest problems Fuente had here? Alumni engagement, former players. Who had the best connection to all the former players? So I think Boleyn could have helped more in that regard. But, as even mentioned in the piece, he was no longer the football administrator after 2018.
Right.
So, okay, Fuente had 4 years after that and still couldn't figure things out. Boleyn wasn't.
But there are job titles and influence, and they can be two different things.
I think it's true, but I think the article also failed to mention that Boleyn is still the number 2 in the athletic department. His wife is chief of staff.
She's the chief of staff for
with the basketball team.
I thought she was director of operations. It's called chief of staff.
Yeah,
okay.
she's Mike. I mean, she's Mike Young's John Boleyn, so to speak.
And all I've heard is good stuff about her in that role.
And his daughter Jalen works on the football recruiting staff, and from all reports, is doing a very good job there. So, like, his influence within the athletic program is probably greater than it's ever been. He had a hand in Pry getting the job here. He was one of the first ones who said, hey, Brent Pry is an option here, and kind of put that on the radar. So to frame him as like everything that went wrong in the Fuente time, and then not even mention that he has a hand in the current staff and how they're doing, I thought that was an interesting framing omission. So I don't necessarily buy the idea that like, oh, Fuente had no chance to succeed, which is sort of some of the point that I got from that article, because there's still, head coach has not all the influence in the program, but major influence in the direction of the program, regardless of the other stuff going on. And there were challenges here. There were greater challenges than I think Fuente or anybody would have imagined coming into this job. But you have to set a vision for the program. You have to make good hires. You have to foster a good environment that players want to play in. You have to have player retention and development. And they struggled in all those regards. And could Bolin and the athletic administration have helped more? Yes, I think we've said that many times, but I think a lot more of that is on the head coach and his responsibilities there.
So there's that saying that success has many fathers. Well, this is a failure that had many fathers.
This was a group project.
Yeah, that's
for sure.
That's the best way to phrase it.
Project that got a big old F.
I remember, and I don't remember what year this was, but it was one of those years where Clemson and Alabama were playing each other, probably for the national championship. I think it was the first one when Clemson lost.
They do it 3 times or something like that.
Do you remember the first one when Clemson lost it? Do you remember what year that was?
I can't. They all
I'll pull it up. Yeah, continue.
I just remember that
2015, maybe
14, 15, something like that. Somebody ran an article at that point in time about the support staffs that were present at Alabama and Clemson, and even though Nick Saban had been doing that for years, since like 2009 or
2017.
Okay. I'm
sorry. It would have been 20. Yeah, I think it would have been 2017.
I think it's earlier than that.
Sorry, 2015-16. Okay. Alabama won 45-40.
Right. So,
yeah.
But I just remember looking up the support staff. The article focused on Clemson support staff. And at that point in time, like one of the people they had on their staff was Brad Scott, the former head coach at South Carolina. And they were paying Brad Scott $220K a year. And they had a whole army of analysts and support staff. You could go see it on their football staff page, and it would be this big. I remember it was like 30 people. You go look at Virginia Tech's football support staff, and it was a lot fewer people. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, crap, something's going on around college football that Virginia Tech is not doing. So I, as some guy who just follows the program, knew about these trends in college football. And then there's a bunch of people that were asleep at the wheel. And I think Whit did not push for larger staffs. I think Fuente, coming from his background at Memphis, probably, and remember, Fuente was at TCU before that, which was a very Virginia Tech-like program, not super staffed or anything like that. I think there were a number of people who were in charge of the situation, and I think you can lump Bolin in here too, who did not see, understand, or grasp the importance of the way college football was moving, and that Virginia Tech needed to do the same thing. Or maybe they did realize it and didn't think Virginia Tech had the money. Well, they've worked on that now. They took it to a higher level at university levels and worked on fundraising with the Football Enhancement Fund. And there's just a lot of people that the bus flew right past them and they didn't catch it.
Well, I think that's easy to do when you have somebody who has succeeded for so long, like Frank did. When you're winning 10 games a year, like he did for 8 straight seasons, why would you change?
Yeah.
No, things are working. Why would you change this equation? I remember interviewing Bud in like 2012 or something like that, and they had just done sort of the professional development stuff they do in the summer, where they go visit another school like that. And they had gone to Ole Miss. I forget who the defensive coordinator was there, but Bud knew him for a while, just to do some professional growth type stuff. And I wrote about this at the time. Bud came back and he's like, they've got an assistant for every coach there. They have somebody like a recruiting analyst or whatever position they want to call it for every single coach. It's like, we need some help in that regard. And that was 2012.
So Bud knew it.
So Bud knew it then. They didn't start a recruiting staff, I think, until 2014.
And even then, it was 2 or 3 guys that they worked like dogs.
Yeah, it was Chuck Canner, Thomas Gary were the first 2 in that role.
John Yetson came along.
They initially had Kavanaugh and Billy Height. Yeah. The old school version of that. It's not quite the same thing as what it developed into, but then it's adding pieces and adding pieces. And Fuente knew that early in his time here, and he was trying to get that point across to people. How much they're getting killed out there because the other schools have all this army analysts and recruiting staff, and UVA has like regional scouts and stuff like that on the road. Like even compared to
UVA staff,
Virginia Tech
bigger.
was struggling. I think that played into that Baylor dalliance.
Yep,
that's part of the reason that Fuente talked to Baylor about that job, is because they could have an army of people there.
By the way, I still think he made a mistake not taking that job. Fuente should have taken that job.
I don't know if he was offered that job.
Oh, okay.
I'll say at the time, the former employer that I worked for had a lot of national people, and I was chatting with one of them, and Bruce Feldman said, "I don't know if he's the top option for that job. I think I could still break this," and it ended up being Dave Aranda. And I want to say Bruce Feldman did break that story. So they might have been vetting a couple of guys. I don't know if it was necessarily a job offer that came out, but either way, I think Chris Coleman wrote the article at the time. The title was "A Shot Across the Bow."
Yeah,
that was kind of a way to say, hey, Virginia Tech, you need to take this seriously. And I think Whit understood the problem. He's maintained that he understood the problem, but I think that kicked things into action a little bit more, and maybe greased the skids for these things to happen, because it was tough to get the positions approved, but then to even fill them. I know that in 2019, Fuente wanted to bring Jerry Kill on full time. They were talking about that in the summer. They weren't able to do that until they freed up some salary. And I believe that was when Daniel Bartelstein left for the college football playoff, and that freed up some salary that they could work and actually bring him in here full time. So it's just, that's the kind of stuff where they could have used a little bit more support administratively and kind of to push that whole thing. But I don't think that's the difference between succeeding at the program and what the program became.
I think even if they had done all those things, I think there were some. We talked about this failure, in air quotes, having a lot of fathers. I think if Virginia Tech had done all of those things right, I think it would have magnified Fuente's weaknesses. In my opinion, and I know you're much more informed than I am, I think Fuente had a huge problem with roster management and player retention.
Yes.
I think they did a pretty solid job recruiting, all things considered.
By the end, I think they turned it, that last class and the one that they were talking about, like, probably got off to a great start, and monster Delane's in this class. They had a couple guys decommit, Alex Orgy, Ramon Brown decommitted.
Yeah.
Pretty highly rated guys that were in that class. I think that last class, there was a lot of Virginia influence in there. There's a lot of good guys that weren't maybe the highest ranked guys, but I think turned into pretty good players, or will turn into good players here. So I think they turned the corner, but it definitely hit a nadir in that 2020 class where they had signed like 15 guys and nobody in state. I mean, there was an issue there.
Yeah. Well, the issue there was, and I had a conversation with somebody who knows. I think that the NCAA changed their rules that you could take official visits in the spring/summer. And Fuente did not react to that right away. Sorry, I can't remember exactly which summer it was. I think it was the summer they were recruiting APR.
Was it 2019?
Probably be 2019, because 2020 is when everything stopped.
And other staffs around the country reacted quickly with having a lot more summer official visits and getting commitments and things like that. And what was told to me was that Fuente just didn't gear up for that part of it quickly enough, and they got behind. This person was telling me, we sat there and watched all of our targets committing to other schools, and we weren't even having them on visits. So I think that led to a lot of the issues with the 2020 class. I think they got caught with their pants down a little bit. And you're right, he corrected it. His last class or two on his way out the door was pretty darn good. But he also had some good classes early on. A lot of 6, 7, 8 4-star guys per class. So now back to the conversation. I like I said, I think if everything else had been right, Fuente still had some shortcomings that would have been magnified. Would he have won 8 or 9 games instead of 6? Maybe, and that would have been enough.
I think I agree with you on that front. I think I look at the timing. That COVID season really took the wind out of the sails. It came in such a bad timing. I mean, you look at the way they finished 2019. Hendon Hooker's your guy. You've got a guy at quarterback. You're returning a lot on defense. I know you're transitioning away from Bud, but you've got a Bud protege. You lose that entire offseason. to do what you want to do defensively. You get to the preseason, Caleb Farley, terrible tragedy with his father, by the way. That kid's been through so much. Opts out in August. That's a first-round draft pick that you lose at cornerback. You have the quarterback issues with Hendon and everything that happened there. I mean, that team was set up for success that year, and it just never got there. And all of a sudden, the quarterback situation screwed up. Hendon Hooker leaves. Braxton Burmeister is not the quarterback you need after that. And then you're going into almost a dead man walking season in 2022 or 2021. Sorry, I'm mixing my years up here. And even then, you're so close. I mean, you lose. They have 3 games that were like 98th percentile win percentage. That West Virginia, if they can score from the 5-yard line, Notre Dame, Syracuse, if they don't blow 2-score leads in the final 5 minutes. I mean, he's that close to going 9-3, and you don't get rid of him at that point. I mean, it's such a fine line on some of this stuff that I think we talk in absolutes and go, oh my gosh, he was a total failure and this program completely fell off. It's like, it was so close to going the other way and being successful and him still being here.
So the margin between winning and losing is so slim. And Fuente sat in that chair that you're sitting in, David, and said, I don't want to blame anything on COVID, but reflecting on the whole COVID era, if you think of the individuals and you think of the organizations that be it a business or a sports program, COVID, if there were weaknesses or sketchiness in a person or a company, COVID damaged them badly. And there were other people and organizations that made it through okay. I think Tech Sideline made it through okay. Maybe if you've got 3 kids, 2 of your kids got through COVID okay, and maybe it really bothered your 3rd kid. And it was just one of those situations where the murky soup of the Virginia Tech football program, it just got damaged by COVID more than some other programs.
There's one question I want to touch on before we close. I think some people read that, and maybe people who were not necessarily in the know were surprised to see all of that stuff that Babcock sort of let happen, so to speak, from the weights stuff that you were joking about, weights weigh the same, to the behind-the-scenes stuff between longtime Associate Athletic Director John Boleyn and Fuente and just everything that went on behind there. How do you feel like it portrayed Babcock? And considering he's still Virginia Tech's athletic director, do you feel like it's a fair assessment?
I don't think it reflected well. I mean, you don't have a story like that that's like, oh, what went wrong over this 10-year period or however long it was where you were the primary athletic director. I mean, if you're at the top of the athletic department and your signature program is flailing like Virginia Tech football has, that's a black mark on your resume there. Now, you look at every other part of his resume, it's going pretty well in almost every other sport at Virginia Tech. So, I have a sense that he knows what he's doing. He's just not been able to get his hands around this football thing and get this football thing going the right direction, which, as we know, is the most important aspect of his job, is to get the football program right, because that pays the bills for everything else and makes life easier in every other regard. So, I think it's a part of his resume that's still a hole right now that they've got to figure out, and we'll see if Brent Pry is the answer. 3-8 in the first season is not encouraging, but there were some challenges roster-wise that they had to get past there. I think they're moving in the right direction, but as always with these coaching hires, you can just never tell. I think
concerning Whit, he's almost elite at hiring coaches. He's very good at hiring coaches. I think some of the organizational stuff, he's not as strong. And it's, Jim Weaver was in some respects the other way around. Weaver was a facilities guy. Whit, the day that he started, said he was about the student-athlete experience. He didn't tell us he was really good at hiring coaches. Turns out he is. Weaver ran a tight organization. I've talked to people that work for him, and they loved working for him. You always knew where you stood with him. He let you know. He was organized. Financially, they ran in the black every year, sometimes egregiously so. They'd make $6 to $8 million in air quotes in profit. So he ran a very tight department organizationally and structurally. And I just get the impression that's not Whit's strength. But he does have other strengths. You know, he is really good at hiring coaches. I think Jim wanted to take a shot with the cheapest person he could get and see if it worked out a lot of the times. He also emphasized a big difference between these guys is Weaver lived and died with football. He put everything into football. And, you know, everybody else kind of got the short end of the stick. Now, it's not like they were $100 million athletic department back then. But I think that Whit tries to run an overall athletic department more so than Jim Weaver did. So just some kind of thoughts on the differences between those two guys.
You say good at hiring, and yet the football resume is not. And you even go back to his time in Cincinnati.
The other sports.
Yeah.
Hired Tommy Tuberville, Cincinnati.
Well, yeah.
Maybe solely responsible for Tommy Tuberville being in the U.S. Senate
But the
right
Fuente
now, which
hire
is a whole
was-
other discussion that I don't want to get into.
But the Fuente hire was a good hire.
It was he outflanked a lot of people to get an in-demand hire at the time. It's a crapshoot with coaches. Most of them don't work out.
Well, particularly
that's the history of coaches. Most of them don't work out.
well, you have to do it in secrecy too. You can't
Right.
date for a long time. You got to like kind of.
It's in secrecy and it's quick. But you look at that, he outflanked a lot of other people to get an in-demand coach, Justin Fuente at the time, who managed to keep Bud Foster. Everybody said it was a coup at the time, and after they succeeded early on, that's the narrative that was there, and it didn't work out. It was just not, in the long run, not a good hire for Virginia Tech. But that's it. It's tough to ding him when he did the thing that everybody said he should have done at the time, and yet it didn't work out.
Yeah. But it is interesting because you look at a lot of his other hires and, you know, two of his first. Yeah. I mean, well,
swimming and diving.
You look at, and even Kenny Brooks, women's basketball, and Buzz Williams was a good hire. Mike Young has been a good hire. I believe he elevated Tony Roby. I mean, he's done a lot of other good stuff. It's just that one football note that's missing. I want to talk about, of course, what's coming up on TechSideline.com. Today is Thursday. We've got a busy couple of days. Obviously, Virginia Tech football season starts next Saturday, which is crazy to think about. We've got football interviews and stuff later this afternoon. There are a couple different stories coming out on Tech Sideline. We're talking to Ron Crook and Xavier Chaplin, supposed to be later this afternoon. So Andy's going to have an offensive line story off of that. Virginia Tech women's soccer opens its home campaign tonight. I'm going to be at that game. I've also got some interviews with Mike Young and Kenny Brooks and some men's and women's basketball players today. So that's exciting. Got some good stuff.
Man, you're a busy guy.
Yeah. And hosting this is just part of my fill-in duties, I guess. Andy's writing a mailbag. You're writing mailbag tomorrow?
Stepping into that sweet Friday mailbag slot that Chris has left open this week.
Yeah, we got to run that. It's our weekly thing we got to do for First Bank and Trust Company.
Well, I think Andy will enjoy that. Hopefully, if you have any mailbag questions for Andy, please, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's via email or whether it's on the message board, send Andy good questions for mailbag.
No realignment questions this week, please.
Yeah.
Watch, I'll say that, then the ACC will vote to expand like tonight at 9 p.m. or something like that.
Yeah. And then are you still planning on running depth chart projections over the weekend?
In some form or another. I don't know if I'll split it up, but I want to do that. I always like doing that before they officially put it out. Although probably has taken a lot of mystery out of some of these things.
Yeah.
We talked about it at length on this thing, but it's still fun exercise to do before they actually put it out.
Sounds good. Well, we've got a lot of great content coming on TechSideline.com.
So a thing I've been doing is trying to wrangle the interns now that they're all back. And we are going to, first of all, Gio's not in witness protection. He will be hosting the podcast here soon, if not starting next week. Gio's actually calling games for the Salem Red Sox. And so like, if you talk about the St. Cloud Rocks, where so many SMA students have gone and called their games, they get to a certain point in early August and they're done. Gio's still calling games for the Salem
And that's
Red
the difference between summer league baseball and minor league baseball.
Yeah, correct. So he'll be back. We've got all of our interns figured out and what they're going to be doing. And so, for those of you that listen to our podcast and stuff like that, we're going to, and remember I said this is the main podcast and we're going to continue to run that on the main podcast feed. The TSL Today that we were doing, we're going to try reworking that into a shorter, more frequent newsy format, and that will become its own podcast feed. And the Triumph Spotlights that we've been doing with the athletes, that's going to be broken out into its own podcast feed. So these are some of the things I've been working on with them, and we're actually going to have an intern run a TikTok channel for us. And I always said I would never do that. Now I have the Tech Sideline TikTok username reserved, so nobody else can go in there and get it.
So they're going to be like following Andy and I around at games.
So it's funny. I was meeting with the interns the other day, and I said, "Well, what do you think about?" We've tapped Morgan Gay to run it. Morgan is a junior this year, and she was looking for something to do, and she's got experience at that sort of stuff. And the other interns think she'll be great at it. But they said, they asked me like, "Well, what do you want her to do?" And I said, "Whatever she wants to do." So I'm not sure what's going to wind up on there. She might meander into Center Street on game day and get some interesting stuff there. So. If you're on TikTok, go follow Tech Sideline because it's actually going to come to life. It's never had a single post there, but
maybe you'll get some behind the scenes stuff.
That is completely intern run. I'm not even sure I'm going to go over and look at it. So that's coming up.
I think that's a good way to wrap up episode 306 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Thank you to all who tuned in. Thank you to everyone on set today. Will Stewart, Tech Sideline's founder and general manager. Andy Bitter, Tech Sideline senior staff writer. Jack Brizendine, big thank you to him. He produced this episode. I'm your host, David Cunningham, TSL's managing editor, signing off for episode 306 of the Tech Sideline podcast. We'll talk to you next week.